Hey everybody, Dr. Bennington here with a short presentation on sedimentary rock identification. So, what are sedimentary rocks? Well, if we go to our rock cycle diagram, what we see is that sedimentary rocks are what you get when you take igneous rock, or really any other rock that's exposed at the surface of the earth, and lift it up above sea level into the plane of erosion, where erosion and weathering break that rock down into mineral grains and dissolved ions, which are then deposited on the surface of the earth in layers to form sedimentary rock. Now, sedimentary rocks have a different sort of suite of minerals than typically found in igneous and metamorphic rocks. And the reason for this is sedimentary rocks form and are stable at the surface of the earth. So they're composed of minerals that are stable at surface conditions where you have a lot of oxygen and a lot of water, and you have carbonic acid, which is the acid that forms when carbon dioxide dissolves in water. Igneous and metamorphic rocks, on the other hand, have minerals that are stable in the Earth's interior at higher temperatures and pressures, where oxygen and water are not quite so abundant. So it turns out that sedimentary rocks have a relatively simple suite of minerals. And the minerals that form sedimentary rocks depend somewhat on what type of sedimentary rock you're talking about. So we divide sedimentary rocks into two very broad categories that account for most of the sedimentary rocks on Earth. The first category we call the clastic or detrital category. So these are rocks that are composed of pieces of mineral that are liberated from pre-existing rock by the weathering process and collect on the surface of the Earth. And there are really two main minerals that are stable on the surface of the Earth that won't break down. So a lot of the silicate minerals, the feldspars, the amphiboles, hornblende, pyroxenes like augite, olivine, these minerals, when exposed to water and carbonic acid and oxygen, will break down. So the minerals that are stable on the surface of the Earth are primarily quartz and clay. So when you erode igneous and metamorphic rock, what you tend to end up with are grains of quartz, which we think of as sand, and clay, which we think of as mud, clay minerals. Now, some sedimentary rocks will contain maybe a little bit of feldspar, and mica minerals are also common in certain sedimentary rocks, but these are secondary components. They're not usually the main body of the rock. The other category of sedimentary rocks are chemical sedimentary rocks, and these are sedimentary rocks where the individual particles of sediment are crystallized or precipitated in the environment where the sediments accumulate. And there are two main types of chemical sedimentary rocks. We have the carbonate rocks, also known as the limestones, and these are rocks composed of mineral grains that precipitate usually in the ocean, and usually because of some biological activity, because some organism is making its shell or it's producing pieces of calcium carbonate mineral, otherwise known as calcite, in their tissues. So just about any organism that lives in the ocean, corals, clams, other kinds of mollusks, crustaceans, algae, plankton, all of these organisms make calcium carbonate mineral to armor themselves, to provide structure for themselves. And when they die and their fleshy parts decay, the mineral part of their skeletons or their tissues is liberated and becomes calcium carbonate sediment in the oceans, which accumulates to form a type of rock called limestone. Sediments can crystallize because of the evaporation of seawater, and you can form what we call evaporite sedimentary rocks, which are composed of minerals that precipitate inorganically as the ions become concentrated in evaporating seawater. Now, in terms of texture, right? So again, the two things you look at when you're trying to identify a rock, you look at the mineral composition of the rock and you look at the texture of the rock. And texture will often clue you into whether that rock is an igneous rock, a sedimentary rock, or metamorphic rock. Sedimentary textures are relatively simple because sedimentary rocks are composed of grains of mineral that become cemented or glued together. We classify sedimentary rocks primarily on the basis of the size of the particles that make up the rock. So we have rocks that are produced primarily from pebble-sized particles. We have rocks that are produced primarily from sand-sized particles, and rocks that are produced primarily from mud-sized particles. And it's easy to recognize the difference between the different grain sizes. Basically, a particle that's as big as or larger than fish tank gravel is considered pebble-sized particles. Smaller than fish tank gravel, but large enough to see with the naked eye and to feel between your fingertips. If you rub your fingers along the rock or in the material, those are sand-sized grains. And then particles that are too small to see with the naked eye fall into the range of mud-sized particles. Other sedimentary rocks, and this is less common, have a crystalline texture, particularly evaporite rocks, which form from minerals crystallizing from the evaporation of seawater, may appear to be crystalline in the same way that their mineral constituents are. And then we have also one other texture category, which is specific to one type of sedimentary rock, a very peculiar type of sedimentary rock called coal. And this is a carbonaceous texture, and it just refers to a rock that's made essentially out of the remains of dead plants, which is what coal is. So let's look at some examples of common types of sedimentary rocks. A very common type of sedimentary rock is a conglomerate, and conglomerates are very easy to recognize. A conglomerate is a rock that's made up primarily of pebbles, cemented together, and typically there's some sand mixed in with the pebbles. There are conglomerates that are pure pebbles, but usually there's a mix of the two. The pebbles in a conglomerate are rounded, which means they have smooth edges. They don't have sharp edges. A rock, that looks like a conglomerate that's composed of sharp-edged pebble-sized grains is called a breccia. Breccias are relatively rare, though. Typically, a large-grain sedimentary rock is going to be a conglomerate. Let's take a look at a typical example here. So if we pick up this rock, we see lots of pebbles embedded in a matrix of sand, but predominantly pebbles. And you can see that the pebbles have a smoothed and rounded appearance. So this is a very good example of a conglomerate. Right? And the grainy nature of the rock clues you into the fact that this is a sedimentary rock. An igneous rock might have large crystals embedded in a matrix of smaller particles or smaller crystals, like a porphyritic andesite. But the larger pieces are going to look crystalline. They're going to be blocky, crystalline minerals, probably with flashy cleavage planes. These are rounded crystals rounded pebbles of quartz, grains of quartz. Typical sedimentary rock made out of sand is a sandstone, and most sandstones are made out of quartz sand, so we call them quartz sandstones. Probably one of the most common types of rock on the continents of the Earth. How do you recognize a sandstone? Well, you look for those little grains of sand that make up the body of the rock. Sometimes they can be difficult to see very clearly, individual grains, if it's a fine-grained sandstone. A good way to identify a sandstone is to let your fingertips be your guide, and on a freshly broken part of the rock specimen, just run your fingertips. If the rock feels abrasive, like sandpaper or like an emery board, then you're feeling those individual particles of sand sticking up from the surface of the rock. When a sandstone breaks, it breaks around the particles of sand and not through them, and that produces that rough, abrasive surface. as with all sedimentary rocks, a good clue to look for to recognize that the rock is a sedimentary rock are fossils. Only sedimentary rocks contain fossils. I bring it up because the particular specimen that's shown in the photo that I just made disappear. Let's see if I can bring it back here. There we go. This is a fossil of a clam, the impression of a clamshell embedded in the sandstone. Quartz sandstones are generally light in color. Often they're whitish or beige. Sometimes they're stained red by iron oxides, but overall light in color. Let's take a look at a typical specimen here. This is a coarse-grained sandstone, so if you look at it closely, it's relatively easy to see the individual grains of sand throughout the rock. Mostly quartz, but a few bits and pieces of other mineral as well. And again, if you run your fingertips across it, across a freshly broken surface, it should feel abrasive. Now, quartz sandstone isn't the only type of sandstone. So sandstones are rocks composed of sand-sized detrital or clastic particles. So sand-sized particles of mineral eroded directly from pre-existing rock. Most sandstones are quartz sandstones, but there are some exceptions. And a common exception is a type of rock we call an arkose. An arkose is a rock composed of sand-sized grains that include a mix of quartz and rock fragments and also some minerals that you typically don't find in sedimentary rocks like feldspars. Arkoses also have a lot of iron oxide in them, so they tend to be reddish-brown in color. We look at a typical example here of an arkose. So what you notice here is a grainy rock, but one where there's some pebbles mixed in there. There's some pinkish red material, which is, well, the deeper red is iron oxide. The pinkish material is some feldspar. There might be some flashy little flakes of mica mixed in as well. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of different types of grains. It's got a sort of an overall dirty appearance. Quartz sandstones tend to look very clean. The grains tend to be all pretty much the same size, made up of mostly the same material. Arkoses are kind of dirty. They're a jumble of different types of material. Another type of sedimentary rock made of sand-sized particles is a greywacke. And a good description of a greywacke might be a muddy sandstone. So in greywackes you have primarily sand, but some clay mixed in with the sand, and that tends to give the rock a dark color. So greywackes, kind of as you might guess from the name, are very often, if not always, gray in color, medium to dark gray in color. So we look at an example of a greywacke here. Looks very much like a quartz sandstone. The main difference is the color. Right, and this is a kind of a medium greywacke. Lots of greywackes are much darker than this. And some very dark greywackes look like they might be made out of mud. How do you tell the difference between a greywacke and a mudstone if they're both just sort of dark-looking rocks? Well, again, let your fingertips be the guide. If you feel abrasiveness on a freshly broken surface, you're feeling sand grains, and so the rock is most likely a greywacke. Now, probably the single most common type of sedimentary rock on the surface of the Earth or in the crust of the Earth are mudstones. Mudstones are rocks that are made out of mud-sized particles that can be either silt, which are microscopic particles made out of quartz, or clay, microscopic particles made out of different clay minerals. It's very difficult to distinguish silt from clay in a rock specimen, so collectively we just call those fine-grained particles mud. And so a rock made out of mud is a mudstone. If the rock contains a lot of clay particles and the clay particles are sort of layered on top of each other, that will cause the mudstone to split into flat pieces, and a mudstone that splits we call a shale. And that tendency to split has a name. We call that fissility. So a fissile rock is a mudstone that splits into flat pieces, which is a shale. All right. So basically all shales are mudstones, but not all mudstones are shales. That's one way to think of it. Mudstones and shales tend to be dull looking rocks, dark in color. The facility of shale is a wonderful characteristic to recognize it. And then one thing you can look for that's very common in both mudstones and shales are fossils. Fossil shells or impressions of shells or impressions of leaves or maybe the carbonized remains of leaves that show up on the flat surfaces of the rock. Let's look at an example. Typical mudstone, well actually this is a shale, a mudstone and a shale. So this is a rock that's splitting into thin layers, and we can see on the bedding surface of the rock some fossil fern leaves preserved. Right, so this was a mud that was deposited in an environment where ferns were growing, and the fern leaves became trapped in the mud and became fossils. And that's an important aspect of sedimentary rocks, is that we can usually look at the characteristics of a sedimentary rock and figure out what environment on the surface of the earth those sediments accumulated in. So in this particular case, we have mud, we have ferns. That suggests a floodplain or a swamp, some kind of low energy environment on the surface where plants are growing and mud is accumulating. Limestones. Limestones come in a wide variety of textures. So you can have limestones that look like conglomerates, that have very large grains, usually broken pieces of shell. You can have limestones that are composed of sand-sized particles of broken shell. You can have limestones that are composed of tiny microscopic particles of calcium carbonate produced by algae or the breakdown of larger pieces of shell. So limestones can have many, many different textures. How do you recognize a limestone? Well, they're typically gray in color. Some are beige, but typically they range from light gray to dark gray in color. Very often limestones contain fossils because most limestones form or are deposited in a marine environment where there are lots of sea creatures living. And in fact, the raw material of the limestone is usually shell material. So in many cases, limestones are basically composed entirely of fossils. So it's easy to find fossils. But there's a quick chemical test for limestones. If you have a rock that you suspect might be a limestone because it appears to be a sedimentary rock, it's dull, it's gray, you put a drop of acid on it. If the acid effervesces, if it fizzes in contact with the rock, that's a good chemical test for calcium carbonate, which is the mineral that limestone is made out of. So let's take a look at a specimen of limestone here. It's got that sort of medium gray, very blocky kind of color, and appearance. And then you have lots and lots of fossils, bits and pieces of fossilized shell, the raw material of that limestone. Put a drop of acid, and we see immediate vigorous effervescence as the acid reacts with the calcium carbonate. A typical example of an evaporite sedimentary rock is rock salt, made up of the mineral halite. Now, it's against OSHA regulations to taste the specimens, but a definitive characteristic of rock salt is that it will taste like salt. But we're not allowed to taste the specimens in lab. Rock salt typically has a crystalline texture. You're looking at crystals of halite. And if you look carefully, you may see fracture planes within the crystalline material that show you fractures intersecting at 90-degree angles because halite has a cubic cleavage. And you see that cubic cleavage expressed in the internal fracturing in the halite rock, or in the evaporite rock. So here's a specimen. Basically what you're looking at here are crystals of halite that are kind of all glued together with more halite. And the crystals have an overall kind of cubic appearance because that's how halite crystals form. Relatively easy to scratch with a nail because halite has a medium hardness. Right, so evaporites are pretty easy to recognize. Rock salt's pretty easy to recognize. It looks like the mineral that it's composed of. And then finally, one last sedimentary rock. This is a real oddball. It doesn't really fit into any category of sedimentary rock. We give it its own category. Carbonaceous rocks. These are sedimentary rocks made out of preserved, unoxidized, dead plant material. So plants dying and piling up in a swamp or a bog will accumulate to form a material called peat, which has kind of a woody texture and appearance. And if the peat becomes buried under overlying layers of sedimentary rock, it can compress and kind of cook down at high temperatures and pressures inside the earth. And that process concentrates the carbon in the material and drives off more volatile elements, and you end up with a very lightweight, not so dense, black, dusty material, which is mostly carbon, and that's coal. Of course, if you get coal hot enough, it will burn. We use it as a fossil fuel, so that's one test for whether a rock is coal. If you can get it to light and burn, then it's most likely coal. Here's an example of a typical specimen of coal. Now, some coal is very dull and dusty. Other coal is more shiny. This specimen has a combination of some shiny material and dusty material. The more pressure you put coal under, the deeper in the earth that it's buried, the more shiny it becomes, the less dusty it becomes. So this rock this specimen's a little bit in between. But it's easy to recognize coal. It often has a kind of a layered appearance. You can see that in this specimen here. It tends to get your hands black and dusty, and it doesn't feel heavy like rock. It's very, very lightweight. All right, so that's our review of sedimentary rocks. I hope you found that helpful. Thank you for watching.